Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
It is good to be back, and we really have a significant task ahead of us today.
Yeah, we do.
Usually we synthesize a collection of articles or maybe a specific news event, but today we're shifting gears completely. We are conducting a long-form diagnostic case study of a single, very dense, very specific text.
Right. And for everyone listening, context is really everything here. The book we are breaking down in this deep dive is The Club of Rome, Architects of the New Dark Age by Dr. John Coleman.
Exactly.
And before we dive in, I want to be extremely clear about the framework of this conversation. This is not a book review. We aren't here to tell you to buy it, burn it, agree with it, or dismiss it entirely.
Precisely. This is a systems-level analysis. We are looking at a specific narrative architecture, a very complete worldview presented by the author.
Yeah, and it's a very intricate worldview.
It is. Coleman presents this comprehensive internal logic for how he believes the world actually functions. So our mission today is to map that system. We need to understand the machinery of his argument.
How he perceives the global hierarchy.
Right. What are the systems of control he claims exist? And perhaps most importantly, if we accept his premises, just for the sake of analysis, what is the ultimate destination he claims we are heading toward?
And I got to say, it is a heavy destination. When most people talk about global systems or elites, they're usually talking about these like trade agreements or diplomatic summits, maybe some corporate lobbying.
Surface level stuff.
Yeah, surface level. But Coleman is operating on a completely different frequency. He's describing a hidden infrastructure that he claims is literally engineering the end of industrial civilization as we know it.
It's a radical reframing of modern history. To even understand Coleman's argument, you have to suspend the standard way of interpreting headlines.
Right, because in the mainstream view, history is basically just a series of accidents.
Accidents, competing interests, chaotic events, inflation, energy crises, social unrest.
Just things happening.
Exactly. But in Coleman's view, these are not accidents at all. They are the calculated output of a design system. So our job today is to take this apart piece by piece. We're going to look at the design of the shadow structure, the incentives driving it, the outcomes it produces, and finally, the crisis in perception.
What we are feeling to see.
Exactly. What is obscured?
So let's start with the namesake of the book, right? The Club of Rome. Now, if you look this up in an encyclopedia or a history book, you get a pretty standard, somewhat boring definition.
Very benign.
Right. It was founded in 1968. It's a think tank. They published that famous book, The Limits to Growth, in 1972. It just sounds like a group of academics who are concerned about the environment.
Sure.
But Coleman suggests this definition is, well, let's say, insufficient.
I mean, insufficient would be putting it mildly. Coleman argues that viewing the Club of Rome, or the COR, as merely a think tank is a fatal category error.
A category error.
Yeah. In his taxonomy of power, the Club of Rome is the chief think tank for the New World Order, but it functions much more like an executive arm. It is the operational hub.
Yeah.
However, and this is absolutely crucial for the hierarchy he describes, it is not the top of the pyramid.
So it's the hands, not the head.
Correct. Coleman places the Club of Rome subservient to a much older, much more shadowy entity, which he calls the Committee of 300.
The Committee of 300. Now, whenever we get into specific numbers like that, it starts to sound very conspiratorial. Who does he actually claim these people are? Is this like a modern corporate board of directors?
No, not at all. And this is where Coleman's historical depth really comes into play. He doesn't describe them as modern technocrats or CEOs. He describes them as the black nobility.
The black nobility.
Yes. He traces this group back to ancient European aristocratic families, specifically the Venetian oligarchy. He argues that the families who controlled banking, shipping, and trade in Venice during the Middle Ages, they didn't just disappear when the Republic fell, they evolved.
They just moved their money.
Right. They moved their base of operations, but they kept their cohesion. They kept their bloodlines and their capital intact.
So that term, black nobility, does he explain that? It sounds deliberately sinister, but does it have a specific historical meaning in his context?
It does. Historically, it refers to the Guelph faction in medieval Italy. These were families who sided with the Pope against the Holy Roman Emperor. But in Coleman's usage, it signifies an oligarchy that operates from the shadows. hence the black.
Operating in the dark.
Exactly. He argues these families possess vast intergenerational wealth that frankly dwarfs modern billionaires. We're talking about the supreme controlling body. In his narrative, they created the Club of Rome specifically to execute their orders in the modern political and economic landscape.
Okay, so structurally, just to map this out, we have the Committee of 300 at the absolute apex, representing this ancient dynastic power. And below them, we have the Club of Rome acting as the executive arm.
Right.
But an executive arm needs a network to actually implement policy. How does Coleman say they do it? I mean, they can't just walk into the White House and say, do this.
Well, Coleman argues that in many ways they actually do, but they do it through what we call the institutional web. The COR doesn't act alone. It sits at the center of a synchronized network of other institutions. Coleman lists entities like the German Marshall Fund, the Aspen Institute, the Wharton School.
That's a really diverse list. You have a policy fund, a humanities institute, and an Ivy League business school.
It looks disconnected on the surface, but in Coleman's system, they are nodes in the exact same circuit. The driving idea here is policy synchronization.
Meaning they all push the same thing at the same time.
Precisely. If you want to push a global agenda, say deindustrialization, you need the business schools to teach that growth is bad. You need the policy institutes to write the white papers justifying it. And you need the political funds to back the candidates who support it.
So the Club of Rome conducts the orchestra.
Yes. And coordinate this so that whether you are in London, Washington, or Berlin, the policy trajectory remains identical.
Now, there's one institution in this web that seems to carry a lot more weight in the book than the others. The Tavistock Institute of Human Relations.
Ah, yes. Tavistock. If the Committee of 300 is the head and the Club of Rome is the hands, Tavistock is the psychiatrist. Or perhaps the hypnotist. Coleman calls it the mother of all brainwashing institutions.
That is a massive charge. I mean, brainwashing is a word we throw around a lot in casual conversation, usually just meaning, persuasion I don't like or media bias. But Coleman seems to mean something very technical here.
He does?
How does he claim Tavistock actually functions?
This is a critical distinction. He isn't talking about a guy in a chair with a swinging pocket watch. He's talking about social psychiatry and systems analysis applied to mass populations.
Treating the public like a patient.
Exactly, or like a herd. Coleman argues that Tavistock, which is based in London, developed techniques to manipulate group dynamics on a massive scale. He heavily references the work of Kurt Lewin and this concept of identity stripping.
Identity stripping. What does that mean in practice?
The theory is that you cannot force a population to accept a drastically lower standard of living or a radical change in their way of life if they are psychologically stable and secure in their identity.
Because they'll fight back.
Right. They have a foundation to stand on. So to introduce a new world order, you first have to dismantle the old one in the minds of the people. Coleman claims Tavistock designs what he calls future shocks.
Future shocks.
Yeah.
Like manufactured crises.
Yes. A series of traumatic events, conflicting media narratives, sudden economic crises, things that overload the public's ability to process information.
So the chaos is the point. It's not just bad management from our leaders, it's a technique to induce passivity.
Exactly. When people are overwhelmed by contradictory information and constant crisis, they enter a state of social psychosis where they just check out, they stop resisting, they look for a savior or a really simple solution to make the pain stop. Coleman explicitly links Aurelio Peccei, the founder of the Club of Rome, to this specific institute.
Right, Peccei. He's the central figure in the Club of Rome's origin story. Coleman mentions he was trained there.
He does. Coleman writes that Peccei was sent to Tavistock for training, where he was, quote, stripped of what few human qualities he had started with.
Wow.
Yeah. He was essentially groomed to be the perfect, ruthless, technocratic operator. And once he was fully qualified by Tavistock, where did he go? He didn't go to a university. He went to NATO.
NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Yeah.
Now, this is where I think the average listener might hit a wall. We are taught that NATO is a defense alliance created to stop the Soviet tanks from rolling into Paris. Coleman is saying what? That NATO is part of this conspiracy.
He reframes NATO entirely. This is one of the most significant flips in the entire book. Coleman argues that NATO was never primarily about defense against the Soviets.
Then what was it for?
He describes it as the political enforcement arm of the Committee of 300. He claims that Peccei used NATO headquarters as his literal base of operations to recruit the founding members of the Club of Rome.
So in this narrative, NATO is essentially a mechanism to keep Europe and the U.S. in line.
It acts as a consolidation of military and political power. Think about it. If a European nation tries to stray from the agenda, say, by pursuing independent national policies that contradict the Club of Rome's goals, the NATO structure is used to pressure them back into the fold.
And the Cold War.
The Soviet threat, in Coleman's view, was a convenient cover story, a bogeyman that justified the existence of this massive supranational police force.
It's a complete inversion of the Cold War narrative. Instead of East versus West, it's elite versus nations.
Precisely. And Coleman insists that to understand this, you have to look at the historical lineage. He argues that if you think this system started in the 1960s with the Club of Rome, you are just looking at the tip of their iceberg. He traces the narrative roots back much further, back to the Bolshevik Revolution, the French Revolution, and even beyond.
He brings up the classic secret societies, doesn't he? The Illuminati, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians. Now, usually when a text invokes the Illuminati, it's a huge red flag for analytical readers. It feels like a catch-all for anything the author doesn't like. Does Coleman actually connect these dots, or is he just name-dropping to sound provocative?
He definitely attempts to connect them, and he does it through the concept of a cult theocracy.
Cult theocracy.
Yes, he argues that these groups aren't just social clubs or political fraternities. They are vehicles for a specific religious, or rather anti-religious, worldview. He claims the French Revolution wasn't a spontaneous uprising of the poor against the rich. It was a planned demolition of the Christian monarchy, orchestrated by these societies to install a secular, state-worshipping system.
So a deliberate dismantling of the cultural foundation.
Right. And he draws a direct line from the Jacobins in Paris to the Bolsheviks in Moscow, and finally to the Club of Rome today.
So the common thread isn't just power. It's revolution against the old order.
Specifically, revolution against Christian civilization. This is key to his whole design argument. He contends that the Committee of 300 and its subsidiaries are fundamentally anti-Christian. He mentions ancient cults like Dionysus, Isis-Osiris, and specifically Gnosticism.
Gnosticism. Okay, we need to pause and define that because it's a very specific theological term. Why does a second-century heresy matter in a book about modern geopolitics?
Because Gnosticism provides the metaphysical justification for all their actions. Historically, Gnosticism views the material world as inherently flawed, evil, or even a trap created by a lesser, malevolent god.
So the physical world is bad.
Exactly. And if you hold a Gnostic worldview, you don't view the material world as something to be developed, improved, or glorified. Coleman argues the elite view themselves as a priesthood that possesses the gnosis, the secret spiritual knowledge that elevates them above the material filth.
And how does that translate to actual policy?
It translates into a total rejection of the Old Testament mandate. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, man is given dominion over the earth, to multiply, to subdue the earth, to build, to steward it.
Right. Human progress is seen as a good thing.
But Coleman argues the elite want to reverse this entirely. They want to strip away man's dominion. They view man not as the master of the earth, but as a bad dragon, a subservient animal that is actively destroying the planet just by existing.
That phrase, bad dragon, that's a direct quote, right?
Yes, from Aurelio Pescia himself. He wrote, quote, "If ever there was a bad dragon on earth, it is man himself."
That's quite a statement from the founder of a policy think tank.
It is. And this isn't just poetic language. Coleman interprets it as a literal statement of intent. If man is the bad dragon, then the dragon must be slain, or at least severely chained. And this brings us directly into the incentives.
Right, the incentives.
Yeah.
Because even if you accept the structure we just outlined, the committee, the club, the Gnostic philosophy, you still have to ask the big question, why? Why would the wealthiest, most powerful people on Earth want to destroy the industrial economy that made them wealthy in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
It feels like the rational actor trap. We assume they want more economic growth because that equals more money.
But Coleman argues their true currency isn't money, it's control. And industrial growth is actually a direct threat to that control. This is the core of the post-industrial zero-growth policy he describes.
Zero growth, which just sounds like an oxymoron for an economy. You always want growth.
Not if you are the Committee of 300. Coleman argues that the primary overarching mission of the Club of Rome is to halt industrial growth, specifically in the United States.
But why?
Because industrialization creates a massive, powerful middle class. Think about the post-war boom. A robust middle class doesn't need the elite. They have their own property, their own savings, their own independent political voice.
They are too hard to boss around.
Exactly. They have leverage. Coleman quotes François Mitterrand, the former French president, whom Coleman actually identifies as a key agent in this system. Mitterrand supposedly said that industrial capitalist development is the enemy of freedom.
Enemy of freedom. That just seems entirely backwards to the modern ear. We generally associate capitalism and industry with freedom.
But you have to ask, whose freedom? Mitterrand and the Club of Rome, according to Coleman, define freedom as the elite's freedom to rule without any challenge. If the population is wealthy and independent, the elite are constrained. They have to negotiate. Therefore, to secure their own absolute unhindered freedom, they must destroy the economic basis of the population's independence.
So the actual enemy is the prosperity of the common man. And this connects to his analysis of economics as a discipline. He really goes after two giants in the book, Adam Smith and Thomas Malthus. Now, attacking Malthus, I totally get. He was the too many people guy. But Adam Smith, the father of free markets, why is he a villain in this narrative?
This is a fascinating nuance in his argument. Coleman argues that we have been taught a completely false history of economics. He views Adam Smith and Malthus not as independent, objective thinkers, but as literal employees of the British East India Company,
Which he sees as a predecessor to the modern Committee of 300.
correct, a corporate state monopoly. He argues their economic theories were designed retroactively to justify colonial looting and massive resource hoarding.
So Malthusian economics, the whole idea that population grows exponentially, but resources only grow arithmetically, so poverty and famine are just inevitable. You're saying Coleman views that as just a cover story.
A very sophisticated cover story for resource hoarding. Coleman argues that the elite fundamentally believe natural resources like oil, minerals, arable land are strictly finite, and more importantly, that those resources rightfully belong to them. They view the general population not as citizens, but as useless eaters.
Useless eaters, that is a chilling term.
It is, and it appears repeatedly in this type of literature. It implies that if you aren't part of the elite, and you aren't directly serving the elite's interests, you are just a mouth-consuming resources that don't belong to you.
A drain on their planetary estate.
Exactly. Coleman argues that Malthus provided the pseudoscientific excuse to say, oh, well, famine is natural, there's nothing we can do, when in reality it was a deliberate policy choice to preserve those resources for the aristocracy.
It's the ultimate Gnostic separation in practice. The elect deserve the world, and the masses are just polluting it by breathing.
Precisely. And this incentive structure, hoarding the world's resources and crushing the middle class to maintain control, leads very logically to the structural outcomes Coleman describes. If you sincerely believe the population is a bad dragon and a cancer on the earth, what is the policy solution?
Surgery. You have to cut the cancer out.
Depopulation. This is where the book becomes truly dark. Coleman points to the Global 2000 report as the smoking gun for this agenda.
The Global 2000 report. I know this document. It was commissioned and released during the Carter administration, right around 1980.
Yes. Now, in the mainstream historical view, it was basically just a demographic projection, a government study saying, hey, the world is getting very crowded. We might have severe resource problems by the year 2000.
It's just a warning.
But Coleman reads it entirely differently. He calls it the blueprint for global genocide. He claims the Club of Rome and the Committee of 300 actually drafted the true intent behind it. He argues the report sets a tangible goal, not a prediction, but a target of reducing the global population by at least 2 billion people.
2 billion. Let's just pause on that number for a second. In logistical terms, that exceeds the casualties of every single war in human history combined. Coleman is suggesting a bureaucratic, institutional mechanism for an event of that scale. How does he propose such a thing could actually be executed? You can't just hide 2 billion deaths.
He argues you don't hide them, you reframe them. The methods he describes are famine, disease, and he explicitly mentions the deployment of man-made viruses and localized endless wars.
Plausible deniability.
Exactly. If people die of starvation because the global economy collapsed, it's reported as a tragic failure of markets, not a murder. If they die of a novel virus, it's an act of nature, not public policy. Coleman argues these are engineered overlapping events designed specifically to cull the herd.
And who is the target of this cull? Is it just a general, across-the-board reduction?
He identifies very specific targets. First, the populations of the Third World, simply to stop them from industrializing and consuming raw materials that the elite want to keep in the ground.
Keep them underdeveloped.
Right. But secondly, and this is the warning he really screams to his readers, the target is the surplus industrial workers of North America.
The American middle class.
Yes. He argues the white-collar and blue-collar workers of the U.S. are being actively targeted for elimination because they are the engines of the industrial growth that the elite desperately wants to stop.
And this brings us to what I found to be one of the most surprising and specific technical arguments in the entire book, his passionate defense of nuclear energy. I feel like most narratives about shadowy global elites usually involve them pushing high-tech centralized solutions. But Coleman says the elite absolutely hate nuclear energy.
This is one of the most distinct markers of Coleman's specific worldview. He is an ardent, uncompromising proponent of nuclear power. He describes it as cheap, clean, safe, and the absolute key to infinite industrial growth. He calls it the fusion torch that could literally solve all resource scarcity overnight.
So if nuclear power solves scarcity, and the elite rely on maintaining scarcity to control the population,
Then the elite must kill nuclear power at all costs. Coleman argues that the entire anti-nuclear movement of the late 20th century, the protests, the no nukes concerts, the massive environmental lobbying efforts, it was all orchestrated from the top down by the Club of Rome.
that is a huge accusation. He's saying the grassroots environmentalists aren't actually trying to save the planet, they are just unwitting foot soldiers for the black nobility.
That's exactly his claim. He argues they were manipulated by Tavistock propaganda. All the horror stories about radiation, the apocalyptic fear-mongering in the media, it was all a designed psyop to make the public terrified of the very technology that would mathematically set them free from elite control.
Does he mention 3 Mile Island?
Mm.
Because that was the big domestic event that really turned American public opinion against nuclear energy.
He absolutely does. He explicitly calls 3 Mile Island a deliberately planned act of sabotage. He argues it wasn't a genuine operator error or mechanical failure. It was a staged event designed to terrify the American public at the exact moment nuclear power was about to become the dominant energy source in the country.
That is a fascinating inversion of the standard narrative. So, in his view, high energy costs are not an accident of the market. They are a weapon.
A vital weapon of deindustrialization. Think of the physics of it. If energy is practically free and limitless, you can desalinate seawater, you can irrigate deserts, you can manufacture goods endlessly. That means infinite growth in a massive, prosperous population.
Which violates the zero growth mandate.
Right. The Club of Rome wants zero growth. Therefore, they must logically sabotage the energy grid. The result is what we actually see. Artificially high costs, total reliance on volatile, elite-controlled oil markets, and the deliberate stalling of the economic booms that defined the mid-20th century.
It's basically a war on technology, or more specifically, a war on emancipating technology.
Yeah.
Anything that makes the individual more independent.
Yes. And he makes a very similar structural point about NASA. He argues the American space program was intentionally neutered. Tavistock and the CR viewed the Apollo-era space program as highly dangerous because it inspired way too much technological optimism in the public.
It made people look up instead of down.
Precisely. It expanded the frontier. He discusses how NASA was systematically stripped of its military-industrial drive and turned into a civilian, human-quality agency focused mostly on monitoring the Earth's climate. The goal was to prevent humanity from achieving escape velocity, both literally and metaphorically. They want us trapped in the mud on a strictly finite planet, fighting each other over manufactured scraps.
But the attack he describes isn't just physical or economic, it's also deeply cultural. This leads us into the cultural destabilization section of his argument.
And this brings us right back to Tavistock. Coleman argues that to manage this civilizational decline without triggering a massive revolt, you need to engineer a crisis of democracy.
Meaning the elite believe there is too much democracy.
Yes, that the people are too unruly, too traditional, too cohesive. So they engage in deliberate social engineering to degrade the moral and social fiber of the target nation.
He talks about the Aquarian conspiracy in the book, which honestly sounds like a hippie manifesto.
It refers to the massive counterculture movement of the 1960s, the rock music, the psychedelic drugs, the free love ethos. Coleman does not see this as a spontaneous, organic youth movement reacting to the Vietnam War. He sees it as a highly sophisticated Tavistock operation.
So Woodstock wasn't just a music festival. It was a mass psychological experiment.
In Coleman's view, absolutely. The widespread distribution of LSD, the promotion of subversive rock music, he argues all of this was designed to fragment the psyche of the American youth.
To break their traditional bonds?
Right. The primary goal was to destroy the nuclear family unit, which he views as the bastion of middle-class strength and resistance. They wanted to create a population that is stone, passive, and totally distracted by hedonism. Because if you are high and listening to rock music, you certainly aren't organizing a disciplined political resistance against the Committee of 300.
It's the Brave New World model of control. Soma for the masses.
Exactly. Combined with the 1984 boot constantly stamping on a human face, he seamlessly links this cultural decay to the economic war via the concept of class war. And here he brings in a very specific historical figure, Paul Volcker.
Paul Volcker, the Federal Reserve Chairman. Now, in standard economic history, Volcker is usually credited as the hero who saved the U.S. economy from runaway inflation in the early 80s by dramatically raising interest rates. He took the tough medicine.
But Coleman sees it from the exact opposite perspective. He says Volcker, acting directly on orders from the Committee of 300, raised interest rates to 20%, not to save the dollar, but to deliberately destroy capital investment in U.S. industry.
To freeze the economy.
Right. Sustained high interest rates make it mathematically impossible for small factories, independent farmers, and local builders to borrow money and expand. It creates massive unemployment, it breaks the power of the labor unions, it destroys the productive middle class, and demoralizes the entire nation.
So let's look at the outcome state he describes here. If we put all these pieces together, you have a demoralized, unemployed, or underemployed population. They are completely distracted by drugs and degraded media culture. They are terrified of clean nuclear energy because of relentless propaganda. And they are constantly being told by their own institutions that they are the problem, that their existence is a cancer on the planet.
That is the comprehensive, terrifying landscape of the new dark age he warns about.
This brings up the most obvious objection to any theory of this scale, the persistence question. If this conspiracy is so massive, involving thousands of people across think tanks, governments, banks, media companies, how on earth does it stay secret? Why hasn't someone left a briefcase on a train or leaked the memo to the press?
This is what we call the paradox of the open conspiracy. Coleman argues that the grand plan actually isn't secret at all. He points out that foundational texts like The Limits to Growth and the Global 2000 Report are published openly for the whole world to see. You can go to a local library right now and check them out.
They literally published the blueprints.
They did. But Coleman argues they rely on a very specific psychological feedback loop in the public mind. Because the documents are public and heavily formalized, we automatically assume they can't possibly be a conspiracy. We are deeply conditioned by movies to think conspiracies only happen in dark basements with men in trench coats.
So the formality is the disguise.
Exactly. If a prestigious global organization publishes a very boring academic report saying we need to urgently limit population growth, the public naturally interprets it as, oh, they're just raising a scientific concern for our own good. Coleman says, no, that is a literal statement of political intent. The transparency itself acts as the ultimate camouflage.
And surely the media plays a massive role in maintaining this perception management.
A critical role. Coleman refers to the mainstream media as the jackals. He recounts a very specific story in the book about a meeting in Washington, D.C. in 1980. He claims the Club of Rome held a massive, high-level conference to finalize the plans for the deliberate dismemberment of U.S. industry. He says top-level government officials were there, but the media enforced a total unified blackout.
So even if you were standing outside the building watching these people walk in, if it's not reported on nightly news for 99% of the population, it simply didn't happen.
Exactly. It falls into the memory hole. And when the media does cover these policy shifts, they completely control the framing. They frame aggressive anti-growth policies simply as environmental protection. And who can possibly be against protecting the environment?
It's a moral shield.
They frame brutal population control metrics as sustainability. The language is engineered, again, by Tavistock linguists to make a hostile agenda sound entirely benevolent. It is textbook Orwellian newspeak.
He also talks a lot about institutional infiltration, this pervasive idea that voting doesn't actually change the trajectory of the country.
The uniparty concept. Coleman argues that modern political parties are just irrelevant, hollow shells used for public theater. He lists prominent names from the era. Jimmy Carter, Walter Mondale, Henry Kissinger, Paul Volcker. He claims they are all essentially middle managers serving the exact same master.
The illusion of choice.
Right. It doesn't matter if you vote Democrat or Republican. The Committee of 300 has their vetted man in the key positions regardless. And to prove this, he points to the persistence of personnel. The exact same names, the black nobility families, the legacy financial elites, they appear generation after generation, century after century.
Which suggests a deep intergenerational commitment to this plan.
Yes. This isn't just a four-year political strategy or even one guy's plan for his lifetime. It's what occultists would call a great work, handed down systematically from father to son. This explains the terrifying patience of their strategy. They are perfectly willing to wait 50 or 100 years to achieve a structural goal because they view themselves as a permanent dynasty.
So we have covered a mass amount of ground here. We've looked at the design, meaning the hierarchy of the committee and the think tanks. We've looked at the incentives, specifically control, and this Gnostic hatred of human expansion, the outcomes, meaning depopulation and forced deindustrialization, and the persistence through media framing and open conspiracy. Let's try to pull this all together into a unified systems view. How do these seemingly separate sectors actually interconnect?
If we take a step back and look at the total map Coleman has drawn for us, we see that the sectors we usually think of as entirely separate are actually fused together at the root. Take the economy and the environment, for example. In the mainstream view, these are often seen as being in direct conflict. We have to balance economic growth with environmental concerns.
The standard debate.
But in Coleman's view, the green movement is the actual weapon used to enforce economic austerity on the masses. You can't just mandate poverty. If a politician stands up and tells people, you must be poorer, there will be a revolution.
Right, you need a moral imperative.
Exactly. You have to tell them you must be poorer to save the dying planet. The manufactured environmental crisis provides the unassailable moral justification for the economic hit that the elite wanted to deliver anyway.
It makes poverty virtuous.
It does. Then look at the connection between religion and politics in his system. Coleman identifies socialism not primarily as an economic system of wealth redistribution, but as a political vehicle for a cult theocracy. He argues that the globalist political movement is driven at its core by a spiritual hatred of the Christian worldview.
So you really can't understand the political maneuvers if you don't understand the theology he claims is driving them.
That's his argument. And finally, look at psychology and governance. This is the Tavistock connection. In this system, governance isn't just about passing laws or balancing budgets. It's about managing the collective mind of the public. The use of systems analysis literally treats the population like a herd of cattle. And how do you steer a herd? You steer them with targeted fear, like the threat of nuclear war or climate collapse, and you manage their anxiety with distraction, like drugs and endless entertainment.
And the ultimate destination of all this steering, the new dark age.
Coleman synthesizes all of this into a very bleak vision, a deliberate return to global feudalism. A tiny, super-rich, technologically advanced nobility, the Committee of 300, ruling permanently over a drastically reduced serf-like population.
A neo-feudal state.
Yes. The independent middle class is completely gone. The sovereign nation-state is dissolved into a centralized one-world government. The average person has absolutely no rights, no private property, and is allowed to exist only as long as they are biologically useful to the maintenance of the system.
It is a profoundly terrifying picture of the world. But now we have to do what we do on this show. We have to analyze the analysis itself. We need to pivot to our core diagnostic question.
Yes, we have thoroughly mapped the arguments in the book. Now we must ask, what is the crisis in perception here?
Right. When we look at this text, what is the fundamental gap between how the public sees the world and how Coleman claims the world actually works?
The primary misperception, according to this framework, is the very nature of crisis itself. The public looks out at the world and perceives random, disconnected crises. We see terrible inflation, and we think, oh, that's just bad monetary policy or a supply chain issue. We see energy shortages and think it's geopolitical bad luck. We see social unrest and think it's an organic cultural shift.
Just the messy reality of a complex world.
Right. But Coleman's narrative argues these are engineered outcomes. The crisis in perception is that we are constantly looking at the symptoms, calling them accidents or incompetence, while he argues they are the direct result of planned destruction.
We are seeing chaos, and he is seeing a very dark order.
Precisely. We also entirely missing the obscured structural layer. When we analyze power, we look at the nation-state. We see the president, the prime minister, the Congress. We think that is where the buck stops. But Coleman argues there is a massive institutional layer above that, the Committee of 300 and the invisible architecture of think tanks like the Club of Rome.
So if you are analyzing politics only at the national level, Coleman would say you are just watching a puppet show and completely ignoring the puppet master in the rafters.
Exactly. So our surface interpretation fails repeatedly because we are using the wrong analytical lenses. We look at events through the paradigm of Democrat versus Republican or capitalism versus socialism. Coleman argues those are totally false dichotomies, artificially created to keep the public busy fighting each other.
A distraction.
Yes. The real defining struggle of modern history, in his view, is Christian liberty against occult theocracy. If you try to analyze the actions of the Club of Rome using standard political science metrics, you completely miss the Gnostic spiritual motivation that he claims is the actual engine driving their policy.
And how does applying the systems-level analysis change our visibility of the world?
It shifts the view entirely. It reframes environmentalism from a noble movement of ecological preservation to a cynical strategy of resource monopolization. It interprets globalization not as the natural spread of free trade and unity, but as the systematic construction of universal slavery. It changes the map from a chaotic, stumbling world trying its best to survive to a highly ordered, inescapable prison being built brick by brick around us.
It's a massive amount to process. And as we said right at the start, this is a diagnostic of Coleman's specific worldview. But I think there's a really provocative thought to leave you with here. Even if you completely reject his historical timeline or the literal existence of a shadowy committee of 300, the structural mechanics he outlines might still be deeply relevant. The managed decline of the middle class, the weaponization of austerity through environmental framing, the bureaucratic detachment of global governance from local populations. You don't necessarily need an occult conspiracy for those systems to operate exactly as he describes them. The system might just be the natural incentive structure of modern technocratic globalism.
It certainly challenges the comfort of believing that mere incompetence is the root cause of our societal problems. Coleman offers a much darker alternative, that the pain is the point.
On that note, I think we have given you plenty to think about today.
Indeed.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.